But I think we can get going if you want to.
Yeah, I think so too. Good.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. Hi, my name is Susan Abbott, and I am a co-chair of the IAMCR Media Sector Development Working Group, together with Nick, who's on the line with us. Can you see Nick? Nick Benaquista and myself are the co-chairs of the Media Sector Working Group, together with Winston Mono at the University of Westminster. And we are delighted today to join the Global Forum for Media Development to present to you a webinar in conjunction with this year's IAMCR conference. The conference itself was due to take place first in China, and then it was moved to Finland, and for various reasons we're all familiar with now, hence the subject of our webinar, it was moved online. And so we're very grateful to the Global Forum for Media Development for giving us an opportunity to work together with them and to introduce to you our IAMCR panel discussion, which will be formally part of the conference. But we wanted to open it up to the media development community at large to have a discussion today about whether or not COVID-19 will be a triggering event for building a new era of media development. And we've assembled today a wonderful group of scholars and practitioners who will present to you their big ideas. But we would also love to hear from you. So in the chat function or on Twitter, using the hashtag MediaDev or hashtag MediaDevBigIdea, we hope that you will share your big ideas. I'd also like to introduce Guy Berger, Director of Freedom of Expression and Media Development at UNESCO. He will be the moderator for today's discussion. Before we begin with the proceedings, I just wanted to highlight to you that a few years ago, thanks to support from SEMA at the National Endowment for Democracy and many scholars with IAMCR, we were able to formally launch the first ever academic working group devoted specifically to media development. And our goal is really quite humble. We simply want to create a space for high-level scholarship and critical thinking about media development, its impacts, new ways of doing things, and also to bring together scholars and practitioners who work on media development research from around the world, particularly highlighting the work of scholars in emerging economies in the global South. Before we proceed to the webinar, I just wanted to highlight a few webinar etiquette. We want to make sure you use the chat function. So in Zoom, use the chat function to add your opinions, your comments, your points of view. We really want to make this an interactive discussion. And so we want you to opine, and if you disagree, or if you feel an idea coming on, please share it there. We also, because we have quite a large group of people who've registered for the webinar, if you have a question and you want to put it to the panel or to Guy Berger, our moderator, use the raise the hand function. This will help us to differentiate between comments and questions, and try to keep your questions as questions. And then, as I mentioned, we want to make this kind of a running theme for the media development sector from both academics and practitioners, using the hashtags MediaDev or hashtag MediaDevBigIdea. Please share with us your big ideas. And last but not least, just to give you all the heads up, the webinar will be recorded. It will be made available after this event if you want to watch it, and we'll be uploading it to IAMCR's conference platform. So without further ado, I'd like to turn everything over to Guy Berger.
You're muted, Guy.
Guy, can you go?
Right. Okay. I thought if I pressed my space bar, I would be unmuted, but it didn't work. So here I am. Thank you so much, Susan, Nicholas, GFMD, and all the wonderful people who are attending this. I looked at the list and so many friends and experts, and it's terrific to have this exchange. So I'll make 4 quick points before I jump in. The first one is I want to shout out to Bruce Girard of IAMCR, if he's here, Bruce. And the reason why is because at the start of this crisis, I wrote to him and I said, do you think IAMCR members could help translate this book of UNESCO's? I hope you can see it. And so he put out the call, and we got 21 voluntary translations of this handbook. So this is a handbook, of course, so relevant to current times. And in the end, there'll be 42 languages of this handbook, which, of course, is vital to understand disinformation in its own right and also as a challenge to media development and to journalism. So thank you, Bruce, and thank you, IAMCR. If anybody else wants to offer translations, please join us. I've just posted a link in the chat here to that publication. That's point number 1. Point number 2, we really need this kind of collective effort because we're, of course, in these terrible times. And we're here today because COVID is not only killing people, it's intensifying the threats to media freedom. It could kill media freedom in some places. It's intensifying threats to media independence from capture. And indeed, it's in danger of killing quite a big number of media institutions. Some have already gone. Well, at UNESCO, we've been trying to monitor and assess this, and we're looking for big ideas. So I'm really looking forward to what people have to say. I'll just post in the chat here 2 of the things that, 2 of the resources we've done recently at UNESCO, which are about what we're making about this period. So I just put these in here. Yeah. Boom, there you go. One of them is indeed by one of our speakers, Marius Dragomir. So if you want to find out what we're thinking about and what we're trying to tell governments about the threats to media freedom, threats from capture, threats to independence, threats to existence of media institutions, at this point in time, take a look at those. So that's my second point. Third point is, I work for UNESCO now. I used to be an academic. And in fact, just before I joined UNESCO, I published an article in an academic journal where I was saying UNESCO had a particular approach to media development, but it didn't define media development. And now I'm here working for UNESCO, and I'm pleased to say that I think there is indeed an implicit concept of media development at UNESCO, particularly in its media development indicators, which is not just any old growth in the media industry. It's about free media, it's about independent media, pluralistic media, it's about the performance of media from a democratic point of view and developmental point of view, and it's about the infrastructural capacity. And so these media development indicators that UNESCO has now rolled out in about 30 countries to assess the media situation, I think these help frame some of the key big picture issues that we need to look at. And since then, UNESCO also has done internet universality indicators, which of course is the new ecosystem within which media exists and is threatened. And then we also have media viability indicators, which are particularly relevant to understanding the economics of media at this point in time. So again, I'll just put a quick link in the chat if anybody wants to see that over there. And I see somebody has already offered to do an Arabic translation of the book. I think we may have that. Sorry, my cable fell out. I think we may have that, but if we don't, I'll come back to you. I'll put my email, and then maybe you can email me, and I can tell you if we have Arabic or not. But if we don't, super, thank you. The last point I want to make is that you'll see in my background, I hope that at UNESCO, we have this international program for the development of communications. which I'm the secretary. So this is a body of 39 member states that for 40 years, this is the 40th year, have been collecting money in the UN system for media development. And so they met last week, in fact, and approved almost 50 projects in 33 countries for just almost $1.4 million, which doesn't sound necessarily like a big heap of money in the total sweep of things, but goes a long way to grassroots media projects, particularly in developing countries. So part of the this IPDC and the meeting that they had last week is they mandated us to proceed and do a consultation on the sustainability issues facing media after this COVID crisis. And so we'll be rolling this out in the second half of this year. What are the policy responses that could assist media sustainability at this key point? And so we're really interested in the big ideas that people have got for that. And we're really interested in also engaging this community on an ongoing basis in that regard. So I think those are the 4 points I wanted to make. And now I'm ready, having introduced that and having introduced myself a bit, to turn over to the panelists. So we've got 5 panelists and 5 papers because they produced these for an academic conference. They're each going to speak for about 10 minutes. I asked them not to do more than 10 because really we need to have time to interact, particularly with all the expertise we've got here. But I'll introduce them before they start. And then I want to also ask them, just by way of introduction, after I've introduced them, I'm going to say, tell us in a nutshell, like in a tweet, what is your big idea? And as you may know, well, as you may need to be reminded, if you are tweeting and you're encouraged to tweet, please use the tag media dev and another tag big ideas. So our first speaker who will present is Audrey Gadzekpo. She's an associate professor at the University of Ghana with more than 27 years of experience in academia and 25 years experience as a journalist in media. She got her degree at the University of Birmingham some time ago. So Audrey, who's also well known to all of us here, tell us in a nutshell, in 1 or 2 sentences, and I'll come back to you for your presentation. What is your big idea? Audrey.
Oh, thank you. Good to see you, Guy, and everybody else. My big idea is just to argue that many news organizations in Africa are struggling to survive. And I think that investing in visual journalism may be one of the ways they can re-engage, they can attract, and they can sustain readers and audiences.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Visual journalism, key you're saying now, that's your big idea. Our second speaker will be Marius Dragomir, who's director of the Center for Media, Data and Society at Central European University. And he has held various positions in open society foundations. He's a former journalist in Romania. People know him well. He spent the past decade doing media research into regulation, digital media, broadcasting, spectrum management, ownership. He's authored many studies and he's published and translated in more than 60 countries. He's also author of a brief that we have just produced. I gave a link earlier, and there'll be a fuller report coming out later on. Marius, what's your big idea?
Responding to some of the big problems that we see that existed even before the crisis, but that intensified because of the crisis, I think what we are looking at is what we call total journalism, and this is an opening, a full opening of the journalism field to other fields. One example would be academia. So what I'm talking about, because we are looking at a situation where journalism will operate without solid financial basis or on very weak financial basis, the only solution is for journalism to open up and work with many other fields and institutions.
Thank you, Marius. When you come to speak, perhaps you could speak a bit louder because it was a bit soft, but indeed, as you say in your abstract, total journalism, by which you mean journalism in cooperation and partnerships with many others. Okay, our third speaker will be Midge Lastrebner. She's a journalist, entrepreneur, experience manager based in Argentina. She's worked as a professor at a university, two universities. She's developed a journalism entrepreneurship course. She's worked at consultancy, and she's co-founder of Sembre Media in 2015, which is a non-profit dedicated to increasing diversity of voices in Spanish by helping digital media entrepreneurs. So, Midge, your big idea in a nutshell.
Hi, thank you, everybody. My big idea is basically a certainty that media can't afford the luxury of lacking a sustainable business model anymore. And this crisis is somewhat of a proof of that. And I want to get into that idea and explore the consequences and the benefits of asking this question and talking about this topic.
Okay, well, we look forward to hearing that. And I'm sure some people will think, yes, journalists have to put the business model first, but if you put the business model first, what happens? What comes second? Is it journalism? Our fourth speaker is Jairo Lugo Ocando. He's Director of Executive and Graduate Education at Northwestern University in Qatar. He's previously tenured Associate Professor, Deputy Head at School of Media and Communications, University of Leeds. He was Head of MA Global Journalism Program at University of Sheffield. Before that, he worked as a journalist and freelance writer in Venezuela, the USA, Peru, and Colombia. He got his PhD from Sussex University. Your big idea, Jairo. You're muted.
Pressing the same button than you. Thank you very much. My big idea is a simple idea, but I think it's a powerful idea, which is to engage the donors, foreign aid donors that assist and support media projects in the Global South, engage more and more widely with open source and free software, and to re-engineer the infrastructure that is used to produce media content and media outlets across the Global South.
Excellent, thank you. I hope all those tweets are coming. I'm not monitoring Twitter at the same time as moderating here, but there you had in a tweet form from Jairo about the importance of open source software as a big new idea. And our last speaker will be Tom Law, Media Policy Consultant to the Global Forum for Media Development. Before this position, he led the Ethical Journalism Network's campaigns, research projects across a range of issues: hate speech, media literacy, migration reporting, good governance, self-regulation, and other subjects. Previously, he was a freelance journalist covering Sudan, South Sudan, and was associate editor of Sudan Tribune. And indeed, he was an observer at this IPDC meeting at UNESCO last week. Thank you for that. Tom, what is your big idea?
Yes, thank you, Guy, and good to see you again. Well, I'm not speaking on behalf of an academic paper. Just to be clear, this is GFMD's idea based on our experience and what we've gathered from surveys of members over the last year or so. Our big idea is basically to say, can we create a standardized and streamlined process where media, when they are applying for funding, can do it in a way which is standardized, depending on the size, depending on the maturity and the capacity of that organization, rather than the situation that we have now, where every donor has a different set of standards, set of procedures, set of requirements. So we want to address the urgency in the situation by making things a whole lot easier for media organizations to actually receive funding when they need it and in the way that they need it, which is not always the case.
That is a super idea, and I think people will love that if you can get that going. So we want to hear more about that later. And I see somebody in the chat has contributed their own big idea, investing in media literacy and making it a fundamental part of education. So maybe we can discuss that at the end. Well, okay, let's kick off now. Audrey, you're going to be the first to elaborate your big idea, and I will start my stopwatch, and I will come in and tell you when you're getting close to 10 minutes, and then if you could try and wrap up. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Guy. I'm going to try and share the screen. We practice this so it better work. Excellent. I hope everybody can see the screen.
I certainly can. I think everybody else can. So please proceed.
Okay. And this is where technology then. Okay. I'd like to start by saying that for years now, news organizations the world over have been finding ways to sustain their operations, and newspapers are particularly challenged, especially in Africa, for some of the same reasons that newspapers are struggling in the West, the competition with digital media, etc. But also for particular reasons peculiar to Africa, such as lower levels of literacy. People are not able to patronize newspapers, and poor incomes. And we've seen increasingly over the years, newspaper sales plummet. In Cote d'Ivoire, in the last couple of years, for example, there's been a 50% loss of income for newspapers. So it's a great sense, there's a great concern for sustaining and for newspapers to survive. COVID-19 has made the situation even more precarious for many news organizations, not just newspapers, on the continent. I've had a few interviews with journalists in Ghana, in Nigeria, and they stress how much pressure they feel now, how COVID-19 has impacted on their operations, and they're arguing that government ought to bail them out. Some say we are frontline workers. We haven't been able to get advertising at these times because people are not advertising, and we ought to be considered in bailouts. And we know that that has consequences also for journalistic independence if governments provide bailouts. But that's not what I want to get into. What I want, therefore, is to say, how can news organizations survive the COVID-19 era whenever that is likely to end? And obviously, what new business models must they be exploring? How do they innovate? And so then I come to my big idea. What do audiences want? What should we be giving African audiences? And it struck me that there is great power in the visual. Why do I say this? The visual framings of COVID-19 in these last couple of months, and then of course, all over the world now, the unrelated but significant fallout from the murder of George Floyd by a policeman in the US serve to remind us all of the importance and in fact transformative power of visual images. So for me, arguably, nothing in recent memory has galvanized anti-racist activism like that singular video clip of a policeman with his foot on the neck of a black man. Equally dramatic have been some of the images we keep getting from COVID-19 from around the world. And therefore, I contend that visual journalism may be one of the ways for newsrooms to re-engage their own audiences in a sustained manner. And so we ought to be interrogating the state of visual journalism in Africa. in newsrooms, in classrooms, on the media development agenda. How should media development be supporting journalists on the continent? And by visual journalism, I'm talking about all kinds of things that we use to tell impactful stories, visual storytelling, web videos, photographs, television broadcasts, data visualization, drone journalism, etc. that drive the narrative of the story. I mean, some would argue that visual journalism has been used in everyday newsroom practice for a while. But my counter argument is that it's usually primarily to supplement a written story in the form of photographs, graphs, infographics, and sometimes it doesn't get the attention that it needs. And so we want, when we talk about improving visual journalism, we want more focus on visual ways of telling stories. It's not enough, I argue that not enough of that is being done properly, yet there's a case to be made for it. Because when it's done properly, it makes news more exciting, more interactive, more creative, more compact. It allows for participation in national conversations by ordinary people because they can connect with the images, they can be emotive, it can drive them to action. It can promote investigative and accountability in journalism as well, and accountable journalism. You can use visual ways of indicating, for example, the nature of corruption, and it's been done. So, and finally, also, virtual viral visuals can reach wider audiences. And so we need to invest in that. But we know that there's a deficit, there's a lack of skills. Again, in some of my interactions with the industry, I got two quotes that I want to share. The first is someone who said, we have videographers who shoot video and photojournalists that take pictures that do not tell the story. So they are doing it, but we haven't really invested in the art and skill of real photojournalism, of visual journalism. And another person who says that our journalists need to learn how to combine, a host of complex resources from computer science, statistical analysis, graphic arts, forensic analysis, groundbreaking research, social media investigations, the memory of witnesses to drive their narratives. And I think that that's really powerful. So it calls for just more than shoot a picture and move on. Data visualization becoming increasingly used. We ought to invest in more skills for journalists, and more newsrooms have to use data visualization to tell their stories, infographics, and these come from newsrooms in Ghana. And then good old photos with impact. Photojournalism is struggling. I mean, reports show how photojournalists are having to do other jobs unrelated just to survive. Many of them are freelancers, and the photographs you see here were taken by a freelance photojournalist, and he had to persuade newsrooms to take his photograph. But you can see how impactful it is. The one on your left-hand side is showing pictures of potholes in Accra. And when these were published online, it generated conversations about shoddy work done on roads and what ought to be done and who should be held responsible. The pictures on your left-hand side are of COVID-19. And this recent one that he took was of burials undertaken by the Accra Metropolitan Assembly of COVID-19 victims. And it was the first time that it had been shown what was being done. And again, it generated conversations about whether indeed figures on the death toll were accurate or not. And so I think that one of the ways we should be thinking about is to identify the knowledge gaps and needs within the industry. Sorry.
Audrey, you have 1 minute left.
The knowledge gaps and needs within the industry, determine visual tools available for visual journalism to address the ethical issues arising from the practices of visual journalism, to build capacity in visual journalism on the continent, to prioritize visual forms of storytelling in journalism schools, to conduct more research to illuminate practices, trends, innovations in newsrooms, and the impacts of visual storytelling, and identify and put more resources to visual journalism. And finally, to put more media development funding towards supporting visual journalism so that we can get stories like this that just by watching tells you what's going on in the COVID fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. I think you also did justice to your topic by having lots of visuals, so that was super. I have a quick question, and then we'll move on to the next one, and then at the end we'll come back to comments from everybody. Well, comments and questions. Please feel free to comment on the presentations as they're going within the chat. That's a nice kind of parallel channel. Audrey, my question to you is, we were at a UNESCO conference some years ago, and I met a teenager, and he said he was part of a youth newsroom covering the conference. I said, oh, that's great. On what medium? And he said, Instagram. So I said, okay, that's very nice. I'm glad that this conference is being echoed to young people. But then I looked at his feed, and there were pictures of people on panels. So this is my challenge too. How do we tell stories, more complex stories, like the story of this webinar, using visuals? Given that it's fine if you have a subject that lends itself to it, but what if you want to tell a more complex story? What's your thinking there? Is it possible?
Well, I think it's possible, although I don't pretend to be an expert on telling complex stories with visuals. I just can look in and see that it's not being done. However, people will have to determine what platforms are most suited for what kinds of stories. So it's just not enough to say, I'm going to tell a story. Some platforms and some tools are much more suitable to use than others. But I really do think that you have a point there, that younger people have platforms that they gravitate towards. In fact, I was shocked for many years now when I always do a poll, how many people in my class get their news? Where do they get their news from? And invariably, it's on a social media platform. So we need to figure out ways of doing news in visual ways for those platforms that people increasingly are using to get their news and information.
Okay, super, thank you. So I think if we monitor the chat, we'll get more comments and points. But in the meantime, let's move on to our next speaker, Marius Dragomir. So Marius, you've got 10 minutes to tell us your concept of total journalism and why that's a big new idea. You need to unmute.
Thank you, Guy. Yeah, sure, yes. Can you hear me better now than before?
Sure.
Okay, because I had some issues. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So good afternoon or good morning, everybody. My name is Marius Dragomir, working with the Center for Media, Data and Society here at the Central European University in Vienna as of this year. I'm going to talk about this new concept, total journalism, that we are looking at as a result of a long period of structural problems in the media, but also following a few modest experiments we have made here through our center. Just for those of you who don't know much about our work, we have been mapping for years legal developments, funding and ownership developments, and technology developments with the view of understanding how that has what kind of impact these developments have. What I'm going to do now in this presentation, because there is need for more to develop when it comes to this concept, is mostly these structural conditions of the media. It's interesting now looking back and remembering the days in February when I was writing on the one hand a paper about world of two journalisms. At the same time, I was writing the paper for UNESCO, which I delivered on the 15th of March, the day when we got under the lockdown. So these are the things that I was writing at the time of when the crisis erupted, and you can imagine that all of them have to be revised now. But looking back at the research that we are gathering, I want to refer to, at some point we have seen in the country study that we have carrying out two worlds of journalism, one captured and lavishly funded by the government, and another one independent, struggling to achieve self-sustainability. And here I want to introduce the concept of media capture, about which we have been writing for a long time. And this is the type of journalism that we see in many countries. And we see, unfortunately, this model being replicated in a high number of countries. How is it? What are the key characteristics of this model? On the one hand, the very high role of the government, basically by funding media outlets or regulating media outlets, the importance of oligarchic structures that control an increasing number of media companies and media outlets. A very important characteristic of this model is the fact that it's not profitable. In fact, we just published the other day a report on Israel, and it was astonishing to see that a vast majority of media outlets there are not profitable. They don't make profit, but they are part of larger conglomerates, which tells you a lot about what is the goal of these institutions. And this is linked with the fourth factor, which is instrumentalization. That means that many of the media outlets are kept in business simply because owners use them for various other interests. They can be political interests, personal interests, other business interests. And this is an exercise that is quite revealing and to some extent quite shocking. What we have been trying to do was to see how much funding is going into this model and how much funding and resources, including human resources, are in the independent journalism field. And what we have seen is that over 2/3 of journalists and funding and resources are actually gone into this captured system, into state media. And in some countries, these numbers are even higher. I can give you, we always give the example of Hungary, where I'm still based, where the government, through funding media outlets, through regulation, through spending state advertising money, they basically control over 70 or 80% of the media. On the other hand, when you look at what is left, and this is, I guess, what is important for all of us, is the independent journalism field. This is the leftover. These are usually media outlets kept alive with donor support. They are most of them trying to achieve self-sustainability. And the most functional so far model that we see in our research is the subscription-based model, and struggling to achieve sustainability. And also the low scale is quite important. These are usually a few media outlets trying to fight a vast field lavishly funded by governments and oligarchs. So this is the first issue I wanted to present, the financial issue. The second is the developments in the regulatory and the legal field. And here, before the COVID crisis hit, we saw a number of laws that were giving governments unchecked power to regulate misinformation. There are various institutions that are tracking progress there and collecting cases of legislation that is used to fight misinformation as a pretext, in fact, to hurt media freedom and to control the narrative, the independent journalism narrative. We had the countries, these countries range from Bangladesh to Belarus to Cambodia, Burkina Faso, Egypt. I think at this moment we have to actually look at the countries that do not have that, because the phenomenon is so spread that you have very few examples where that doesn't happen. You have also cases like Brazil, where the police is setting up task forces tasked to identify those who spread fake news and put them in prison. And the second trend that we see here, we see a tendency to misuse legal provisions to extend the government control of the media. And again, we have a lot of examples. A recent one was in Bulgaria, where the Bulgarian government is using European Union directive as a pretext to change the law to extend its control over video platforms online, because that's what this European law is saying. But of course, the aim of the European Union directive was totally different. Now it is being misused to actually bolster their control on the media. So this is what we had. What happened when COVID hit, and what is going to happen after? Especially when it comes to the financial aspects, we are really looking at we are heading into a massive financial crisis in the media, and I don't think that's new for anybody here or elsewhere. And we have seen a lot of stories in the recent months about the need of the people to be properly informed, the growing demand for accurate, objective news content, and that is all true, of course. But at the same time, we see some disturbing trends. On the one hand, we see a decrease in the public support for the media, and here I'm talking about people willing to pay for content. You have probably seen the extreme example in the UK of the BBC that has come under attack. It came under attack before the crisis when the government was trying to dismantle its funding model. But since then, over the past 2 to 3 months, a growing number of households were refusing to pay the license fee for the broadcaster for various reasons. Some of them.
Marius, it's Guy
Yes.
here. I apologize for interrupting. Just to signal, you've got 2.5 minutes left.
Sure, I'm almost done. The second is the collapse of the emerging business models. And here, as I said, subscription was picking up in a number of countries. That is coming under a lot of risk these days. There will be a decrease of state funding. We already have signals in the media. At the same time, the government will remain a major player in many countries. And at the same time, we see a lot of signals from governments that there will be a decline in development funding for the media. When it comes to the legal issues, you already have seen, I don't have to repeat that, but you saw a number of governments that introduced new rules on access to information. We had examples across Europe of governments saying that the journalists should only reach out, only use information from official sources that are collected and presented by the government. We have a number of serious and dangerous trends in data related regulations that are restricting free speech, and this is related to how in many countries apps are used to track people with the pretext that they are trying to ensure public health. And basically what we are looking at is a world where the government is gaining a key role in content regulation online. So the response is total journalism. Here I want to mention the two dear friends, scholars from the University of Santiago de Compostela, who spoke and who wrote about total journalism at the time. They referred at the time to total journalism as a concept where journalists have to make use of all the tools available to actually to prop up and distribute their content. What I'm having in mind and what we have been discussing, because we are looking at the lack of a solid financial basis, at least for several years to come, because we are looking at increasingly captured environments, because we are looking at very harsh regulations favoring large players and state media, and because we are looking at a situation where there will be insufficient financial support, we look at a situation where journalism has to open up to new forms of collaborations. But of course, they have to be more structured, better articulated, and large scale with other fields and institutions. I mentioned in in the beginning that academia is one of the obvious partners. We have been trying and implementing here at the center a few modest experiments where basically students and academics work with journalists, and we try to use and share our resources, and that has worked. And I think in the future this is the way to go. And secondly, I think the focus has to be on rebuilding the economic base of journalism, and by totally opening journalism to collaborations with other sectors of the digital economy. As you see in various parts of the digital economy, most of the companies that are large scale and successful, they operate in various areas. Journalism or content production is the only field that stays in its own sector, and I think that has to change, and it will have to change in the post-COVID crisis. I'll stop there, Guy.
Thank you, Marius. A quick question which gives you 1 more minute of time, bonus time. How could these collaborations avoid the dangers of capture?
Well, first of all, I think it's I'm talking about fields that are sharing the same problems. As you know, our own university was attacked by the government, the same government that attacked the media. So what I'm talking about here is is institutions that are vulnerable to capture, and that put together resources to fight that. How to avoid that? Well, at the end of the day, they can simply close you down, so you cannot fight that. But I think with innovation and models that stay outside this overspreading capture through funding and all the other mechanisms that I described, I think there are ways to actually resist. I think that the problem is really the economic base of journalism, because that is changing, and we are already seeing every day increasing number of journalists losing jobs, increasing number of media outlets coming up under very harsh financial problems. So that the two are in a way related.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we also have to explore a bit about how these new partners themselves may have interests in influencing the integrity or independence or autonomy of journalism, have their own interests, whether they're NGOs, universities, and so on. So I think that's important to consider as well. But let's move on. And thank you for that interesting idea. I think it does get us beyond the sort of self-centered, inward-looking perspective of media as an isolated field. And it points us towards looking for allies. So our next speaker is Mijal Lashprebna. And Mijal, again, you have 10 minutes, and I'll jump in and tell you when you're getting to about 8 minutes. So over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Guy. Thank you all for sharing your big ideas. I basically have this idea that I want to expand. For me, it's a good start saying to you all that media can't afford the luxury of lacking a sustainable business model, but it's obvious for some of you. And I think this is an excuse to have a conversation about what media independence looks like, or what it means to you. And as well as we had this reflection, or we have a concept about independence as individuals in our lives, we need to deal with these questions. What is independence as media, as journalists? And sometimes we don't need to have this conversation until we have a crisis or a disagreement. And basically, this conversation goes around money and values. And I think we kind of take a tough approach to this concept. So that's why I want to create this moment to create relief and have a laugh, because we need to develop a better relationship between those two in order to be strategic. So my name is Mijal. I'm one of the co-founders of Sembra Media, a nonprofit organization that aims to support independent digital media in Latin America. And we are an organization led by 2 co-founders. And we have this amazing team around the region and 15 ambassadors. We call them ambassadors. They are researchers, teachers, they are journalists studying what independent digital media in Latin America are doing, how they are sustaining their business, what type of content they are developing. And from that investigation, we have a media directory, a live media directory that has more than 800 media from Latin America, the US Hispanic market, and Spain. And there you can find not only the information, the links for the media, you can also know how many people integrates their team and how they found this media, because we need to give them a platform, but also we need to get this information out there to be able to talk about it, to be able not only to analyze and have conclusions on this market intelligence, but also we need to have a conversation on how and why we are deciding to go for these business models. So from that business intelligence, we create trainings, like workshop seminars, and we have an online school. We are very, we work a lot with the community. For us, these media are our community, but we also try to create a networking relationship between journalists, entrepreneurs, investors, academics, stakeholders in general. And also we develop programs to support with grants, consulting, mentorship, and also we share what we learn. We first study, then share and train, and then support. That's our method. So going back to this big concept. Basically, talking about money and values, when we study these media during the past 5 years, we found out that their core values are they found this media to tell them told stories, to escape censorship, to create innovative content, to increase trust in journalists, which I saw we were having a little debate in the chat. We've seen also in our directory, since it's live and we keep updating the information, that social movements such as feminism in Latin America, and obviously the crisis in 2013, 2014 in Venezuela, the crisis Nicaragua is going through for the past couple of years, have ended up with many new digital media. And these crises are a trigger, and right now we are in a global crisis, and we have to see what new media are gonna be creating, because obviously creating a new media, it's not the difficult task. The task is to sustain and be safe while doing that. And journalists are vulnerable, and that's why we have to reinforce this idea. In our research, with the Inflection Point report in 2017, we found that Latin American media are almost half of them are under attack. And this means journalists are under attack, their teams are under attack, their cyber content is under attack. The content of their audiences is also vulnerable. So in order to be able to have a structure to defend against all these attacks, you need to be well cemented. And we found that the organizations that have the resources to deal with these constant changes, constant challenges, have a diversified business model. And this is very important because the majority of the media we see in our directory has already a diversified business model. And this is very related to their values. because their diversified business model allows them to be independent, to be credible, to be agile, to be innovative, which is very much the reasons they started their media. But also we need leadership mostly in times like this. You are seeing right now a group of media founders that we mentor, and we basically found that leadership is key, and also that this independent digital market, it's a great ecosystem for women to break the glass ceiling and be funders and strategizers and leaders, to have a voice, to give others a voice. And when we go back, when we go back to the decision making and we see in which situations we are right now, if you don't have anybody thinking about the business model in your organization, you have real consequences. What we've seen is that the organizations that had at least one paid member in their team to manage the business had 3,000% more income per year than the organizations that didn't. This is a serious number. I just want you to remember this. This is a key element. And this is not about like thinking all the time about business and money. This is about how to sustain better, how to be strategic about this organization that you want to keep alive, to create all this value for your community, for your society. We really need journalism right now. We really need journalism right now. And there is a created demand, and we've seen, at least in Latin America, we've seen a really huge increase in audiences. We don't know how that's gonna develop, but we've seen that. And we really think that sustaining these media or keeping them viable is key. So we created an article that we published in Sembra Media in Spanish, and also it's published in IJNet, thank you IJNet, in English, where we went through these 4 topics. Basically, I'm gonna go really fast and I'm gonna post the link to the article so you can read it in your own time. But basically, for organizations to go through the pandemic, we really think, and it's something my colleagues mentioned before, alliances are key. We've seen many different media align for content, for resources, for new type of business, not only grants, not only investigative program, they are developing services they didn't have before. They have to innovate, and sometimes these small teams don't have all the resources, the talents they need for that business to happen. So they are creating alliances. In Venezuela, they've been doing this for many, many years. They are kings and queens of this model of alliances and commercial alliances. Obviously, it's important to have some of the team involved in the re-strategizing the entire, yes,
sorry to interrupt. Can you begin to wind up?
Yeah. And it's important to re-strategize and go all virtual in this time. So when we talk with media this day, we are trying to give them the chance to ask themselves the questions and try to involve the team into giving a minute to the thought of strategizing. I was seeing a few couples of on the chat about slowing down and trying to make smarter and better content. I think it's honestly, slowing down is a privilege, but if you can be strategic and try to pull some of the resources into strategizing, it's very key, very important to go through a crisis. And also reaching out to the most important people, funders and readers. Obviously, they need to know what you're doing, why what you do is important, and how you're dealing with this crisis. That's the way to keep them involved because basically we need to understand as media devs that journalism is a service. We are serving a community. We are serving a society. So I just wanted to leave with this idea. We needed this new mindset. We really need to think how we create and collect value, so we don't feel embarrassed or bad about having a great business model for our super brave work as journalists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Midge. Well, I wanted to make a short comment that I think it's going to be a challenge perhaps about how a business logic keeps its place. So you don't have the tail wagging the dog, because what I think one sees with many internet, the big internet companies, is that they basically are not offering, they're offering services to make money, and they don't really care how they make that money in terms of exploiting data, allowing low quality content, hate speech, etc., etc. They don't care about it. But I think that what you're talking about is people who want to make money in order to publish, not publish in order to make money.
Exactly.
And so it's always a question: how do you get that business model to be in service of the mission rather than the other way around?
When you have a clear idea of your purpose as an organization, you have a better idea of who to ally with and which companies, which organization, which segment of the society is interested in your work, and it's interesting on your work being able for certain community. So if you have a really clear purpose, it's a better way to start that path into the business model idea, which is gonna change, and that's exhausting, but it's good and healthy also.
Thank you for the inspiration. And we did get some questions beforehand from Hafsa Javed, asking about exactly the kind of points you've touched on. So I hope, Hafsa, that if you're on the participants, that your questions have been answered. Let's move on to our next speaker. Hero, you have 10 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me just share the screen and the presentation. So okay. So this is a topic, a big idea that is probably not that new, but I think there's an opportunity now to take advantage of ideas that have been for a long time there. Actually, back in 2006, I myself got a small grant from what was then a company called Sun Microsystem to set up an open source free software in the University of Stirling in Scotland. And the idea was to create this newsroom to train future journalists to interact and use open source free software. That project ran 3 years with funding from Sun Microsystem, and then Oracle bought Sun Microsystem and they cut the funding for the project. And then I left, and the newsroom then was renewed with back to commercial. So I'm hoping this time with this COVID crisis, we have the opportunity to understand that this is not only about software, but actually this is about creating capabilities in the Global South, which at the end of the day is what foreign aid is. By the way, sorry for putting the cover of my latest book, but as you know, academics are shameless in promoting themselves to sell the little numbers of books that we sell. Okay, so the first thing is that of course the reason for foreign aid towards media development has to do today as a legacy of the Cold War in pushing for liberal democratic models to create resources to increase capabilities and diversity, and to of course avoid media capture in the countries where you have authoritarian regimes or a semi-authoritarian regime. I myself was born in Venezuela, so we, as you know, we are facing a series of systematic attacks against the media there. The other thing, of course, is it's something that my colleagues here in the panel have mentioned already about the sustainability of the media projects, make them viable financially. I have my own thoughts about that, and we have published a couple of papers about financial sustainability. But looking at a variety of projects available that we looked at, in the most conservative terms, software eats between 20% and 30% of the budget of any given project that is being funded by donors abroad in the Global South. That's a huge chunk. One of the reasons, is that if, let's say, a Venezuelan sets up a media outlet in Caracas, normally they send it by themselves. They're probably going to get pirate copies of any software they're using. But if they're working with an international donor, they have to work with ethical rules. And part of that is make sure that the software that they use actually comply with copyright standards. So overall, there is an issue of ethics, but also it's an issue of viability. And I imagine that most of you remember the famous initiative pushed by Nicolás Negroponte, the founder of the MIT lab and the World Bank, of the $100 computer in that time. And it was a computer that wind up and that you put it and didn't need electricity. That project failed or was not sustainable. And part of the reason is the type of software they were using. That Microsoft was involved in this initiative. When the time came to renew the license for the use, there was an issue there of renewal. Microsoft at that point wanted the money, and that didn't happen. So for three reasons, I think that this idea is very important. One, of course, is the cost. It lowers the cost of any project. B, it gives the freedom of the participants to develop and adapt that project to your own needs. Open source is not a proprietary architecture, so it allows participant projects to do. And third, and probably most important, you create capabilities in the Global South in a way they can engage and can develop their own skills and their own knowledge in expanding. And by doing this, they can also create South-South collaborations that otherwise you see. You cannot intervene, let's say, Microsoft Office to modify that program, but you can intervene in any open similar software to do so. Now, normally, I'm not going to stop too much in explaining this, but there's a difference between open source software and free software. Not all open source software is free, and not all free software is open to interventions from programmers. But most of them follow general public license, and a lot of them, a great deal, works on Linux platforms, and that has a numbers of advantages. When you, for example, you not only you save money in the software itself, but also the hardware. You take a computer from 2007 and you put Linux as an operating system, and that computer will operate like a computer that you bought yesterday. It reduces the amount of memory, the processing time, it's quicker. So you can even recycle all computers, and that in times of budgetary cuts counts a lot, There are some pros and cons on using open source and free software. Installation, in the commercial, you just, if you have a Mac, you open it and that's on. It's like, it's very easy, very intuitive to use. Linux and other open source software requires installation knowledge. But again, that's when donors can come in. That's when training and education come in. That's when centralized and decentralized support can come in. Most of the commercial software has support, speech mark. Anybody who has called to 1-800 number of Microsoft or Mac can be waiting for hours before they actually solve the problem. But those centers don't exist. I mean, you can use Ubuntu from Linux and you have some sort of support. But the business of open source is basically a business based in collaboration, but also in the support of services and modification. And that's very important. If you are a small newspaper in El Salvador, for example, like Voces, which is a newspaper that was funded by and created by foreign aid, and you need a content management system, editorial content management system. The Hermes, which is the software used, let's say, by the Sun in London it costs something like $140 per station. Now, there's 2 or 3 equivalent open source software that it's free, and that you can adapt to your own newsroom. Same thing for radio. You know, if you use Audacity, that's going to be free. The cost of most open source software is it's free or very low if it's an open source paid. And while in other commercial software, you have to pay either a whole license or a per year license, particularly now that you're doing. So as I said, by switching to Linux, for example, you reduce cost of computer. You also reduce the risk of viruses and attack and hacking. You know what governments like the Venezuelan government is really bad at? It's really bad at hacking Linux platforms. They know how to hack Microsoft operating system. They know how to hack, you know, a lot of things. They can't, once they get into Linux, they're in trouble. They don't know that. They don't have that capability. And governments normally don't have that capability. So, so it pushes to create capabilities, and it also fosters South-South cooperation, because all this open source software has groups, user groups around the whole world involved into this, and they're like all geeks who want to help others. So it's really good. If you just have to put an email or post something in a board, immediately you get hundreds and hundreds of people writing to you. Oh, you can fix this. Let me help you. This is the code. They send you whatever you need. It's a very interesting experience, which I had with my students when we had these experiments. So most people think of open source software for production, and it's good they think of production because there's many possibilities. Here are just a few of the many that you have. Audacity is widely used in radio station. It's a free software for radio production. GIMP is
2 minutes, Hera.
Okay, thank you. GIMP is excellent for, it's equivalent for Photoshop, Scribus for design, InDesign, etc., etc. But also for data analysis. We have R, Rhino. Mastodon, for example, is an alternative for, the one in the bottom is an alternative for Twitter, but it's much better than Twitter because it's a decentralized Twitter. Nobody can censorship, nobody can control you, and you create your own nodes of distribution of information, and you can create, particularly now in the COVID crisis, if you want to create health communication effectively, you would use Mastodon. Okay, you can't reach the majority of the public in the North, but you can create groups, decentralized groups. Imagine a Twitter in which you create particular nodes of communication and you attract people. And that's free, and that's absolutely available, and it's open source. You can intervene and modify. Now, who is using this? Well, the good guys and the bad guys, as you can see. InfoWars, anybody who knows Alex Jones, he uses open source because he's so paranoid that Bill Gates wants to, implant a chip to all of us through a vaccine that he actually uses open source. And in Venezuela, Porrea, who's a Chavista, pro-Chavista, semi-critical website uses, and I've been studying them and others, but also a lot of radio. For Flaxo and Fe Alegría uses, for example, Audacity and open source in their production. So strategic approaches I would recommend in this idea. First of all, the funders need to embrace this as an idea of building capability, and they should come together to provide centralized sources. Instead of everybody duplicating efforts here, it would be great if the donors can come together and create centers of support and distribution of free software for the projects they have, or at least create a catalog of what is available and how can we support that. But also, let's embrace this in terms of developing the new media ecologies, because it also opens the opportunity to push journalism beyond what it has done historically, which is writing and producing content, and actually incorporates analysis, tools for analysis and for order. Some scholars have been looking at this. I'm just adding this, but there's a big, vast body of scholarly research in this area, and that, of course, donors need to look at, and academics need to disseminate better to make sure that we understand the experiences that other people have had in this area. Thank you.
Ariel, thank you so much. A very quick question. Yeah. It seems that the name of the game, to some extent these days, is not necessarily production of content, but data collection, aggregation, analysis, and that means artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
what's your take on the role of AI and open source AI in this space?
Most of the top program software that is developed at the moment for automatically generated content is in open source. So, you know, here the game is completely different from that area. I mean, you know, the patents are particular for some or a few programs, but most of the software that is used in content generation is being developed in Python, for example, which is an open source. And Professor Eddie Borges here at Northwestern Qatar, he's been looking a lot at that, as Seth Smith also, who has been looking at that. But there's a lot of most of the software in artificial and in algorithm is being done in open source.
Okay, thank you so much. I see there's some questions in the chat, but perhaps you can respond in the chat. Tom Law, over to you.
Thank you, Guy. I'm just going to share my screen. 1 second. And thank you all for the interventions so far. It's been very interesting. And I just hope that my final intervention will be as thought-provoking. Okay, here we go. I hope you can all see that. So before I get to my big idea, I just want to highlight that obviously, I feel like an academic when I say that obviously you have this big idea, but you have to also consider A, B, C to Z. With that in mind, I wanted just to point everyone towards the Joint Emergency Appeal for Journalism and Media Support, which GFMD coordinated and was published on May the 3rd and was signed by over 175 media and journalism support groups. And it addresses what governments can do in terms of policy. It addresses what funders can do, as well as media and journalism organizations themselves, what we can do. It talks about tech platforms and intermediaries and telecommunications companies, advertisers and audiences. So I've just posted the link in the chat for everyone to refer to. But for my intervention now, I'm going to focus just on one of those groups. So I'm focusing on one of these groups in full knowledge that we have to address all of these different actors. Now, I'm going to talk directly about funding. And funding from philanthropic organizations or intergovernmental organizations or governments or other funders, which form a piece of the pie for many media organizations. And for some in the global south, especially startups that we've seen over the last few years, they can be a much bigger part of that, as opposed to services that they provide or their advertising revenue or even subscriber or membership models. So, but particularly about funds for media development in that sense. The appeal calls for increasing the funding, but also more flexibility. It also talks about creating emergency funds. We've seen some initiatives in that regard, but also on a practical note to make sure that representatives of journalists and the media sector are involved in aid coordination and these discussions, and also respect for editorial independence. Now, I know these are not exactly new concepts, but when there's an emergency like this, there can be a tendency to forget lessons that we have learned already, and we should make sure that we are learning from previous health emergencies in the sense that programmatic funding can inadvertently shape the agendas of media organizations. So we expect to see, and we are seeing in some cases, a large increase of funding around content. So, please, we'll fund you to produce this content on health, for example, which is needed now. But often programmatic funding has a consequence of it can create media as being almost a client of the funder to deliver certain messages. And so we have to be conscious of the way that funding is given, and perhaps consider that if we're going to give money to this organization, we're going to have to consider their ethical standards, their commitment to good governance, the audiences they serve. And if they tick those boxes, then can we not trust them to actually cover health, gender, diversity, human rights, without us saying you have to commit a certain amount of resource or produce a certain number of stories, for example, on that particular topic? Can't we give that choice, that editorial freedom to those organizations? And can we, well, I said, someone earlier described GFMD as the global fund for media development. I'm afraid we are the global forum for media development. And so our role is to, exchange knowledge and ideas. And so I think that if funders of media development could find a way to provide this emergency funding with less strings attached and have more trust in the organizations that they want to fund for them to make editorial choices, I think that would help them in terms of it creates less reporting that they have to do with limited capacity. It also helps them articulate their independence. Yes, we receive funds from this organization. However, it doesn't affect our editorial independence. And when your model, as has a significant slice coming from international donors, it can be difficult to articulate that independence to your audience. But if there were less strings attached in terms of the subjects that had to be covered, that could potentially be very helpful. And we need to also try and make sure that media development and support for media is included in the wider response to COVID-19. We have to make sure that in discussions that are happening elsewhere, not particularly on media development, that we are included. But at the same time, we have to avoid the pitfalls of seeing media as a means to communicate certain health messages, which they can be, but we have to make sure that it's signposted as a advertisement or a public service announcement, rather than in some cases we have seen that that can be somehow confused in the eyes of audiences. And core funding and flexible funding. I think it's something that's come up from many members and partners of ours, that what they needed before COVID, and what they need even more now, is funding to support their core operations. Yes, they need support for capacity building, but so often donors are too focused on wanting to fund training or capacity building, when actually having the funds to pay for the higher security for your physical office, for example, of one organization that I was working with recently, whereas the donor wanted to fund something completely different. Can we find a way that we give that flexibility to the news organizations and to the media organizations themselves? Now, moving on to kind of the big idea that I flagged at the start. Can we find a way to standardize the process that media can apply for funding? Can we find a way that for a startup, medium-sized and established media, depending on their capacity and their maturity, so a gradation of the amount of information, the complexity that we demand of them in exchange for funds. And we need to make this in more languages. Often language is a barrier to applying for many funds, as well as having the capacity of actually hiring a development officer or someone whose job is to seek and apply for and use the right language and format the CVs in the right way. A lot of media don't have that capacity, and we're asking too much of them to do that. So can we actually say, okay, until they get to this level of maturity, we're not going to put so many demands on them, and maybe we're not even going to ask for them to produce certain content to say you have to cover these themes. If we trust that media organization based on their good governance, their ethics, their quality standards, etc., their commitment to diversity, if we trust in that, can't we leave the choice for them to make instead? And can we look at, who is their audience? Is there an underserved audience? Can we think about that kind of criteria instead? For that to happen, we need to have a lot of people who have their own agendas and their own reasons for funding media to agree. But if we also agree that the way to fight this infodemic, the way to support democracies around the world is a free and independent and strong media and journalism's role as a public good, then how do we encourage donors to act in a slightly different way? Now, at the moment, this is where research and evaluation reports go to die. They go into someone's drawer, they exist in a PDF, and what we've learned from the thousands of projects that are conducted by media development actors and donors are not widely available for everyone to learn from. What we want to do is to make sure is to reach out to donors and to collaborate with our partners and our members to make sure that everything that we've learned collectively as a community is researchable, is available, so that we can have an evidence base for asking for more core funding, for example. So we can have an evidence base for suggesting that, you know, a big change in the process of how money is applied for is actually needed and would be more effective. We need that evidence base to take to those communities to actually establish change. So it has to look something more like this rather than something stuck in a drawer. And what GFMD is proposing as a means to an end to help us achieve many of the big ideas and the change that's been discussed already is that we have to create this evidence base, make it easily available to funders, to other actors such as people who are implementing journalism support projects. And so last year, we conducted a survey of our members, and they basically
you have 1 minute.
Thank you, Guy. That greater focus on research and learning to enhance understanding of our own sector about what works, what doesn't work in different contexts would be very valuable. And this evidence base would help establish the priorities for the sector. So we can actually, in a much more articulate way and with much more evidence, speak to the donor community and say, this is collectively what the sector needs, but on an individual level, by country or by region or by different types of media, these are the kind of support actions that will be effective. And so to do this, we are hoping to create an international media policy and advice center, Impact, which will basically be a virtual innovation center so that some of the ideas discussed today can be discussed, and the evidence and the learnings from all of our partners can be put in one place so that everyone can learn how they can make their interactions more effective. And it will do this by having a range of resources in terms of project design, monitoring, evaluation, and it might even help us to convince people that matter that, for example, the big idea that I just put forward is something that they want to embrace and work on together.
Okay, thank you so much. And again, let me pose a quick question to you. It seems to me that quite a lot of donors are still of the view that there's not really market failure, there's a failure of innovation, and that what needs to be funded is innovation in media. And a lot of people would debate that, of course, but to the extent that they want to put funding into that, there's some movement, of course, towards subscription models as one thing that could be built, but you do have, in many parts of the world, people who can't pay for subscriptions, although they do pay membership of churches and burial societies and other things. And I'm just wondering to what extent your big idea could articulate with this innovation push and actually make it easier for donors and recipients to experiment a bit with innovation about audience revenue streams, basically.
Absolutely. I mean, what we hope is that Impact, this new center, will actually be able to bring together examples, case studies, lessons learned from innovation in terms of different ways to monetize journalism, whether or not that be subscription, membership, and whatever. But also, I think we also have to acknowledge that whatever way that we slice this, there isn't enough funding for all of the journalism that we need. because of the way in which, especially online advertising works, there are infinite places where people can advertise, and that huge demand means that it's much harder to monetize journalism in that sense. So I think the point I'm making is that funding of journalism forms a slice of in terms of international funding, forms a section of the pie for many organizations, and we want to make sure that that is as effective as possible. Now, innovation, absolutely, we have to find new ways of doing journalism that audiences engage with. It could be through visual journalism, as was mentioned earlier by Audrey, and we need to keep looking at innovation in terms of business models and in terms of how we present our journalism. I wouldn't for a minute disagree with that. We need to encourage that, we need to fund that, we need to learn and share that information more widely, and that's what we hope we'll be able to do. But at the same time, I think we can also hopefully agree that at this point in time, for many parts of the world, they are laying off journalists in huge numbers, or they are about to. And if we want to make sure that we are not going to lose them into then and the media organizations themselves to exist, to do that innovation, we have to make applying for structural core funding to help them survive easier, and we have to encourage donors to see the value in that, as well as funding capacity building, as well as encouraging innovation. I think that at the moment, I'm just suggesting that the balance between a focus on innovation, between capacity building, as in training, and actually deciding this is an organization which fits our criteria of meeting an underserved, of trying to serve an underserved audience. It has, a commitment to good governance and ethics and produces quality journalism. It has a commitment to diversity and the stories that it covers, and a commitment to actually making sure their business model works in the long term. But can we actually make sure that they receive the funding they need in the short term so that they're there in 6 months' time, in a year's time? That's the point that I'm making. It's more about trying to maybe find a better balance between those different kinds of support.
Okay, so thank you for that. I think that was very interesting. I still would have a question about this notion of underserved audiences, because although indeed I can see that it is relevant, there is an issue of investigative journalism into corruption. Is that an underserved area, or is that an underserved audience? And so if you only make it underserved audiences, I think you may miss some things that one would want to see supported. But at any rate, I mean, that's a minor point. So we have 25 minutes, just over that, left, and which is great. So now I think we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. We have questions in the chat. I would encourage all the speakers, panelists, to look at that and answer some of those points there. But I think we have maybe 10 minutes for people to take the floor and make some short but informed comments. And then I'll wrap up after that by asking the panelists to give their final intake. And then I know that our organizers will want to make some points about follow-up. So please, now we're going to, if you go to your participants list, and if you want to raise your hand, that's the way you're going to tell me that you want the floor to make a short audio intervention. So I don't see any hands raised yet. Going. It seems that our participants are all keen on typing rather than talking.
There is one hand raised.
There is a hand raised.
Yes.
So it's not showing on my thing here. So let me just, perhaps if I scroll down. Who is it? And then we can say, please.
Onyango.
Okay, excellent. I'm sorry, I don't see you on the issue. It should be with it. I haven't clicked. Yeah, Joan Achieng Onyango, please. You have 2 minutes to make your point.
Okay, thank you so much. I would rather ask a question instead of making a point.
Okay.
Okay, on the last presentation, if that's okay, on the last presentation, they talked about donors and the media. So my question is, how can the media deal with donors who have certain expectations that they want to be fed, like certain expectations to be fulfilled before they receive donors from these organizations? There are donors who are really strict and they want certain conditions to be followed. If not, then they don't really give help. How do we deal with such situations, especially for the future?
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Tom to follow up when I give the floor to him after this round of comments from attendees. Let's have some other attendees. Please raise your hands. I see we've got such fantastic people, and I know many of them. Gordana, Virginie, Sophie, Sue, Caroline, Mary. I have the other list somewhere here, but where are you? Let's hear you. Avenu, please. And after that, we have Lawrence Pintock, we have Hayes, we have Brigitte, we have Ramsey, we have Jacob, we have Ellen, Vanessa, Bruce, Zoe, Joyce. So, Venu, yours, and then I hope some others are going to raise their hands.
You have another hand raised, Guy.
Okay, so Venu, it's yours for now. Venu Aurora, you might be on mute. Venu, you raised your hand.
Yes.
Yes,
Can you hear
please
me?
speak. Super.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry,
Yes,
my
we
microphone
can.
was not. All right, sorry.
Yeah.
So specifically, and I don't know whether there are the similar laws in other countries. So in India, for example, any foreign funding in media is not allowed. So we have special regulations that do not allow foreign funding in media. And so that really cripples a lot of progressive work that organizations may want to do with alternate media organizations. And I just, I wanted to put that out in the forum here, especially because the conversation has veered towards sustainability and finding funding support from donors. And I know that UNESCO supports a lot of that, but UNESCO's funds are really small. And then how do we encourage innovation when international funding is not welcomed in countries like India?
Thanks for that. And again, I'm sure our panelists can answer that. I could just give a very quick comment that I do know the Quint in India, they do, they sell fact-checking services to Facebook and others. So it's a commercial transaction rather than a donation. But whether that's enough to innovate and run a media organization on, I guess that needs to be assessed. But we'll ask our panelists to comment on that issue as well. Zoe Titus, you raised your hand.
Good afternoon, Guy and panelists. I have two questions, well, comments and questions. I've looked around at available funding for media organizations at the moment, and these are very, very small pots of funding that come with huge administrative burdens. But my biggest concern is at the moment, it seems that the bigger grants are projects in development. And the concern is that 6 months down the line, the media that we want to support and save may actually not be there to save. So that's the one issue. The second issue is media development organizations supporting, journalistic outfits, mainstream media, et cetera, those involved in advocacy. I think another discussion must be had about their sustainability, because it is not the media houses that engage in advocacy that effect policy change in this respect. So a discussion on that topic, I think, would be well received.
Okay, super. So I'm looking for some more hands in the hands raising technology, please. For those of you who are still not sure, you click on the participants button and then you can raise your hand there. Ruth Gomez, Sabrina, please. You're muted at the moment.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Greetings from Spain to all participants, and congratulations for these brilliant presentations with so much knowledge. Thanks a lot to all panelists. I think that all the issues that you have mentioned, sustainability, technology, capacities, are really very much connected, and they converge in a major global concern, which is the trend of discrediting journalism at different levels. I don't know if you agree with me, but how we can reverse this? Is there a way to campaign for journalism development, not only in the global south, but also in developed nations? Or are we talking about a lost battle already? Thank you so much.
Yes, great point. I think because of time now, we're going to switch back to the panel. And I'm going to ask them each to make a comment or two, not more than 2 or 3 minutes, because we need to have time for Nick and Susan to wrap up at the end. So let's go in the order that we had the panelists speaking. Audrey, any thoughts on these comments, questions in the chat on your other panelists' points of view?
Audrey's had to leave for another meeting already, Guy.
Oh, really? Okay, well, that's a pity. But anyway, okay, so who was after Audrey then? It was Marius. Marius?
Yeah, sure. Very quickly, because I focused on for this panel on the big idea, which was this discussion about collaboration and total journalism. But I just wanted to stress, and this relates to some of the comments, that other responses are equally important. Maybe they are not big ideas, but for example, policy work is extremely important. Of course, it becomes even more problematic and even more difficult because, as we can see, governments have now a lot of arguments to support, to have other priorities than the media. So the fight on the policy level will be increasingly difficult, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. And of course, there is a big role for the media development sector to play there. At the same time, there are other areas where the sector can intervene. Solidarity is one of them. It's of course, that should come from the industry, from the profession, from journalism. And at some points, that was an empty word for many in the field, but now that's becoming increasingly important. We have seen cases in a number of countries where for the first time newsrooms got together and called on governments not to keep a lead on information, not to create these systems where only official sources of information should be accessed. So I think that is becoming also increasingly important. And finally, a quick one on donors. Usually the Guy, I think the donors look at both, working for one of them. I also know that they try to address both the market failure and the innovation failure. And I think many of them are looking into both and funding that. The problem, and again, it's very interesting to see that when we collected the cases of independent journals and independent media in many countries, a vast majority of them are funded by donors. So that's a good example because it shows that they achieve sustainability. But at the same time, that is not at all sufficient. And of course, donor organizations realize that their funding is extremely small compared with the vast sources of funding contributed by the state. That's why I think, especially as we are heading towards a defunding of the sector and an increased role of the government, I think donors would have to think about trying to get the media that they support into increasing collaboration and increasing using of resources from many other fields, as many as possible.
Thank you, Marius. Midge, your last thoughts?
So
2 minutes,
I
please.
just, I just wanted to answer. I saw a question on the chat room about thinking about sustainability in a centralized and decentralized way. And I honestly think there is not a magic recipe for this, and that's what's what makes it so difficult. And our markets, we are talking about different regions in this call, but honestly, in between our own regions, there's so many different type and kind of media, and that makes this conversation very complicated. And I just want to acknowledge that every media needs to create its own cohesive business model, and some of that is aligning and creating partnership with others and trying to be a part of a large movement. And some of that may be something that exclusively works for their audience, their purpose, the impacts they want to create. So just want to reinforce that there's a mix there. It's not like it's not a conversation with black and whites. It's not a conversation with extremes and slogans. This really is a case-by-case research and attempt. So that's why I really think it's important to keep an eye on the centralized efforts. I think Tom's presentation is very interesting, and there's a couple of efforts we can pursue as a whole. But honestly, I think, to be honest, what we've seen in our research is that every media has its own logic, and what we need to do is to talk about this and to ask for help and align and create partnership and look for the resources we don't have for our own purposes. So that's my...
Thank you, excellent. Hero. You're muted still.
Sorry. I'm just going to introduce a little bit of history here.
Okay, I need to say quickly.
Yes, a quick history, because we forget that in the past, most media was not sustainable. I mean, I never, as a journalist, very few newspapers, I actually work in the Global South, were actually sustainable. They all depended. El Mercurio, for example, Chile, in the middle, it was saved by Pinochet injecting money. We know this. And so I think there's a preoccupation about sustainability from the point of view of the traditional economy. But we have researched this area, for example, Jose Ricardo Alemán and myself in Latin America about the sustainability. We have a paper about sustainability of the digital media in Latin America. And one of the conclusions is, who cares? You know, these people are doing good journalism. Some of them might last 2 years, some of them might last 5 years. But one of the things that we need to think about is how we create a collective way of collectively supporting this. And I think foreign aid has a big role. I don't think in Venezuela there will be independent journalism today without international aid. And as in India, is proscribed, but it still gets there. And I think we need to put a little bit of a historical perspective into this. That is not about having one project to develop. It's about, if anything, is about creating capabilities over time that people can create and recreate and reinvent media. If something fails, we need to have journalists who can create another one and start another one from scratches. And I think that's one of the things that we need to introduce into the future perspective. It's going to be very few of these media outlets who will be sustainable all the time. And in the cases of those who have been sustainable all the time, like the CIPER in Chile or others, some of the time they get co-opted by bigger media who goes in and buy them, because if they're very successful, they tend to be bought. So there's also the issue of independence. And I'll leave it there, Guy.
Thanks so much. That was a great point. Tom.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I would always encourage more funding for investigative journalism rather than less. I didn't mean to give that impression. Just to respond to some of the question that came to me and some of the comments. Martin Scott, thank you for the question, Martin. I will share with you the survey of donors and the survey of members that helped kind of, was the research that triggered the process that led to the idea of this new centre. And yes, we hope to remove one obstacle for donors in terms of the kinds of funding and how much, but it's not the only one, obviously. In terms of the question about why people will actually share this information with us, I hope it will be because of enlightened self-interest. Because if we are demanding as journalists and as a sector transparency of others, A, we need to be transparent ourselves, but also we can collectively learn from sharing this information. So yes, there'll be some information that for competitive reasons won't be shared. There'll be some information that for free expression reasons and security reasons cannot be shared. But we hope to be able to digest some of that and at least share what is possible. Just responding to Mel from City University, we hope that this collaboration with academics to provide an evidence base to get more information from practitioners and make it more widely available for academics to use, researchers to use, and to help design media development projects and influence policy. That's exactly what we hope the Centre will be able to do in the future. And in terms of the question that came to me, how do you as a media organization ask your donor for more core funding rather than funding which is programmatic and attached to certain outcomes or content? It's very difficult for you as the, it's not really in your hands to be able to do that. One of the things that GFMD tries to do is to represent and be a go-between, a medium between the donor community and smaller organizations to actually put forward that argument. And we hope that we will be able to help you make that argument more persuasively in the future. So please do be in touch and we'll be happy to discuss how you might be able to do that further. And for time reasons, I'll leave it there. But thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to answer all of them.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I think that was a great segue into passing the floor from me back to Susan and Nick. And before I do that, just to say this has been a really super discussion. I'm going to put in the chat.
You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry, I think that's a great segue, Tom, to me handing the floor back to Susan and Nick. And I just put into the, now I'm unmuted. Am I muted? Okay. I just put in the chat the email address if you want to keep in touch with UNESCO on this consultation. But this has been a super discussion, really, really stimulating. So thank you, Nick, and thank you, Susan, and the floor is back to you.
Thanks, Guy. Thank you so much for your excellent moderation, and thanks to all of our terrific panelists today. Just to remind you all, I'm Nick Benaquista, and along with Susan Abbott, I'm a co-chair of the Media Sector Development Working Group, which is a working group within the International Association of Media and Communication Research. And I just want to remind everyone how you can continue to contribute to our big idea and the Media Sector Development Working Group, in addition to participating in today's webinar. So our big idea in this working group, very briefly, is that media development as a space needed a space where scholars and practitioners from all around the world, from the North and the South, could come together and have a really open and productive and frank discussion. We've been encouraging scholars who work in the field of media to bring their critical perspectives as critical friends, to understand the field of media development as a practice that's conducted internationally and at the local level and in communities, and to bring their critical perspectives to help us to come up with innovative ideas and to be better at what we all do. We're also asking the practitioners to come ready for frank and open discussions that we sometimes don't have the opportunity to have in this field, and to question their assumptions and to question old ways of thinking that I think are likely that some of them need to be left behind. And this COVID crisis, as tragic as it has been, I think has reminded us all that we need to really think in a fresh and radical way about how we preserve journalism. I think the conversation today has also reminded us, as Midge has reminded us also, that there's no blueprint. And what we need is a lot more diverse, localized, contextualized thinking. Tax benefits for journalism might work in Canada, but state subsidies used for capture are precisely the problem that we're encountering in places like Hungary and Kenya. A business model may work in a commercial basis in one place, but partnerships with universities and international funding might be the answer elsewhere. We need localized thinking. We need all hands on deck, and we need a lot of fresh thinking. And that's what this group is about. And there are several specific ways you can continue to contribute to this. The first way is through research and publications. So going forward, I'm going to share a survey with you guys that asks you how you would like to keep contributing to this group. And the first way is to join the International Association of Media and Communication Research, join our Media Sector Development Working Group, and come and present papers with big ideas. The pathway is to typically present a paper at the conference, and you'll get great input from people like these here. And then we've published a book already. We hope to be publishing special editions of journals. And there's pathways to publications at CIMA and GFMD. So let's get our ideas, and from more people, from Southern scholars and Southern practitioners, we encourage you to join, and let's get these ideas out into the world. Let's also use this space to find research partnerships. So if there's someone on this call that you'd like an introduction to, get in touch. We'd love to see practitioner organizations and scholars working together. And we have big unanswered questions that we've been addressing today in terms of, is trust in journalism on the decline? It sounds like we don't know for sure, or that the situation is actually very different in very different places. So lots of open questions, lots of need for better data. Let's get to work on that. Second way that you can be in touch, that you can continue to help, is if any of these big ideas, total journalism, visual journalism, are of interest to you and you want to make these big ideas a reality, be in touch with us or directly with the panelists, and we will try to pair people up who want to take these big ideas and move them into the world, get them funded, work on policy campaigns. Whatever your interest is, let's move this from the ivory tower to the control tower. And thirdly, if you have a big idea that you would like to present, we're considering perhaps making this a series this year. Be in touch with GFMD or with, I'm seeing do you still hear me? My connection is unstable. Be in touch with us if you'd like to pitch a big idea, and perhaps we can make you a panelist in seminars to come. So with that, we hope that this is not just a conversation. We hope to continue this work in the real world and throughout the year. And please also put the IAMCR 2021 conference, optimistically to be held in Nairobi, perhaps more likely to be held online, on your agendas for July 2021. And thank you again, all of you, for your great ideas, your big ideas, and your energy and enthusiasm. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add a special note of thanks to Guy Berger for an excellent job moderating. That was really wonderful. And for all of our panelists who took the time to put together their presentations and PowerPoints. Also want to thank IAMCR and Bruce Gerard for working with us to support our new Media Sector Development Working Group. And we hope that people will join us and write with us and help us think through all of the wonderful challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Thanks, everyone. Going to log off now. Have a great afternoon or evening wherever you are.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.